forgot I put the softball in that intro, which is funny because I have an image from that coming up. Thank you so much for joining. As Sumia said, this is Effective One-on-Ones, maximizing your virtual check-ins. I imagine this is relevant for just about everyone on this call, and I'm really excited to talk to all of you about it. This is my second time speaking at a Women Who Code conference. I had a really great time last time, so looking forward to another great one here. I'll say right off the bat, please feel free to use the chat function. We will have time for Q&A at the end. So if I see any of your questions, I'll jump into them when I can or cover them at the end. And with that, I think we're ready to jump in. So welcome once again. Big question, why am I here in this session, not on the planet, not qualified to answer that question for you? So you might be a manager who's looking to up-level your one-on-ones. Maybe you're an IC who's looking for tips on how to better use their one-on-one time. IC, by the way, stands for individual contributor. It's a term that we frequently use to refer to someone who does not have any direct reports. Maybe you're an aspiring manager and you're looking for some ideas for how to practice your future people management skills, knowing that at some point down the road, you're going to have direct reports and you're going to want to make the most out of your one-on-one time. For all of you who fall into any of these categories and everyone else, welcome. You're in the right place. So what can you expect from this session? Your expected takeaways as defined by me. First is a waterfall structure for your one-on-ones. So an idea for how to host one-on-ones consistently that gets you through all of your primary points. Some best practices for effective one-on-ones. And I'll also throw in some tips specifically for virtual settings. But if there's anything you're curious about or anything I don't cover, please feel free to put it in the chat and I'll definitely get to it. And finally, some ideas for ways to practice. And yes, it would not be a Kelly presentation without a SpongeBob, GIF, or GIF. So here is our obligatory one. All right, really quickly about me, I'm Kelly Anlas. I use pronouns she, her, and hers. My bio was accurate until approximately 2 weeks ago. I was working as an engineering manager at Stash. I just, as of this week, started as an engineering manager at Twitter, which is very exciting. I actually invited some of my Twitter colleagues, which is funny because this is one of the first times I'm meeting them. So previously to Stash, I was at a company called Clearpool Group for nearly 5 years. I started there as an individual contributor, moved into a dev manager role, and then Clearpool was eventually acquired by the Bank of Montreal, which was really exciting. I realized when I started talking a lot more about people management, I backtracked to see, when did I start doing this? I started managing people, I think, in fall of 2016. So I just had my 5-year anniversary of that. So all of this information is based purely on my 5 years of experience and the good ideas that I have wholesale stolen from my fellow engineering manager colleagues who are equally, if not more skilled at this than I am. As I said in the bio, I really love softball. I have an image here from a charity softball tournament that I ran with my best friend for many years. It's currently on hold because of COVID. I also, avid theater goer, really excited that Broadway is back. Highly recommend Six for anyone in the New York area. And I'm a director for Women Who Code NYC. I'll have a reminder at the end to come and join us in that meetup group and join us for some events in the future. We'd love to see you all there. All right, diving in. I want you to take a minute to consider your one-on-ones with your manager or a prior manager, depending on what your situation may be. And in the chat or just to yourself, I'd love to hear, what is the most important thing to you about your one-on-ones? So again, if you're an IC, think about your meetings with your manager or a manager in the past. If you're currently a manager, this can be, how do you feel about your one-on-ones with your direct reports or with your manager? One thing that I always remind new managers of is to take into consideration that the time that you're spending with your direct reports, it can start to feel a little bit routine as the manager, but to them, that time is as valuable as the time that you feel with your manager. So always kind of keeping into perspective just how important that time together is. All right, some are popping up. Recognition, feeling supportive, effective listening, constructive feedback, opportunity, routine, recognition, heard and actionable steps, actionable feedback, goal setting. I think you might have all gotten a look at my slide deck because we're going to cover quite a few of these. So thank you everyone for jumping in with those answers, and please feel free to add more as we go along. Some popular answers both in this chat and when I talk about this in some of my workshops or with friends are a time to catch up, human to human, getting help with problems and problem solving, prioritization, relationship and trust building, feedback, as we saw, goal setting, as we saw, and of course, career development. One thing that notably is not on this list is updates. So for some people and in some companies, depending on culture, depending on managers, they do use this time primarily for updates. I personally don't. I think that work updates for the most part happen or should happen outside of this one-on-one time that should be kept as a priority for these reasons listed here. So that human-to-human connection, talking to an individual about them as a person and not just them as an employee, and figuring out what are all the things that they need to succeed both now and in the future. So the feedback, the goal setting, etc. Some common questions. What's the best cadence and length? So it varies, and that's okay. Generally, direct reports are going to meet every week or every other week. Skip levels, which is when you meet with your boss's boss or conversely with your report's report, or informal relationships, so things like mentorship, can be as frequent as once a month and as frequent as once a year. The way that I explain it to people is consider how frequently the things that you're discussing, like your main topics, are going to change. So with a direct report relationship, the topics that you're going to be discussing are the things that you're working on every single day, or the goals that you're setting for every week and for every month. So the frequency with which that information is rolling over is pretty quick. So you want to make sure you have those updates. Versus with your skip levels or in a mentorship relationship, you tend to talk about more overarching concepts, more bigger ideas. So those aren't going to turn over as frequently. And therefore, it's okay to meet less frequently because the updates are less frequent. I also say to keep the length as short as you can to cover the necessary topics, because meetings will expand to fit the time that they are given. So if you set aside an hour for your one-on-ones each week, they're probably going to take an hour. It's the rare person that's really good at saying, okay, we're done with our topics and we are now officially ending this meeting. I had a colleague at Stash who was excellent at it. His name was Eric. The rest of us are not so good. We're going to expand. In the same way that when you go to a restaurant, you can always order more food. You can always schedule more time to talk if your topics in a given week exceed the time that you are given. So my tip to you, try to plan for them to be as short as possible to cover any necessary topics. My general advice before we go into the structure is to be prepared and then go with the flow. First and foremost, take notes. I've heard stories about people who apparently remember everything that they talk about in all of their one-on-ones. That's not me. I need to write everything down. I recommend that for everyone. In addition to both helping you remember things, it will also serve as a good basis for any time that you either want to reflect upon any progress that you've had or for the somewhat dreaded performance review cycles. Anything that you have written down going into that situation is going to make your life a lot easier. Secondly, be an active listener. So a lot of the advice that if you've looked recently into like, how do I show up well for an interview? Like, how do I appear to be present? How do I bring good energy, especially virtually? This is one of those times where it's a lot more difficult to come across as an active listener virtually than it was when we would all be in person. Take that advice. So this is not the time to multitask unless you're taking your notes. It's a time to be present, to be looking at the camera, to be making sure that you're hearing what's being said. A tip that I frequently use is I'll summarize back to someone what I'm hearing them say, like exactly like that. Like, okay, so what I'm hearing is X, Y, and Z, both to demonstrate that you're paying attention to what the other person is telling you, and also to get the clarification that your understanding of what they're saying matches their understanding of what that they're saying. A lot of times we'll talk about the idea that communication has like 4 steps. It's what I think I say, what I actually say, what you hear me say, and what you interpret from that, which means that there's a lot of places where communication breakdown can occur. And one-on-ones are the place where you want your communication to be the strongest, and you want to have the most similar and understanding after you come out of it. So be an active listener. Have a process and then be flexible. I like having a process, and I'm going to share mine with you because it allows for the routine to become comfortable. This is really big in your trust building. Think about for yourself, like when you show up to a meeting and like, you know what's on the agenda, you know who's going to be there, you know what's going to be expected of you, versus a meeting where you don't have all of those comforts going in. You're going to feel a lot different about the outcome of that meeting. You're going to feel a lot different going into it. And in these one-on-one settings, especially as a manager with a direct report, you want them to feel as comfortable as possible, because that's when you're going to get the most honesty from them. That's when you're going to have the best, most open conversations. And that's essentially what's going to serve both of you the best going forward. Prioritize questions, not answers. This is another thing I think we all discover as we move through our careers, is we start with thinking that we understand quite a bit. And the more we learn, the more we realize that we don't know. I always say we have no idea what people are going to say to us. And I think if we don't ask them what they mean by certain things, we're not going to understand what is underlying any concerns, and if they have any thoughts or questions that they might bring up. So prioritize asking questions. And when appropriate, aim for takeaways and then follow up on them. I love takeaways. I almost have them from every single one-on-one, no matter who that they're with. So let's go through this structure that I've been talking about. As I mentioned, it looks like a waterfall. That's intentional. So we start with a check-in, and we'll go through each of these in detail. So here's just a high level. Start with a check-in. Mine is, how's it going? If you've ever had a one-on-one with me, I'm sure you can vouch. I probably started it with, how's it going? Intentionally vague. Second, if you need to, go into a work check-in. So specify, tell me about work. How's that going? Afterwards, do some feedback, go into some goal setting, and wrap up with other topics. So what other topics do you have this week? Let's dive into each of these in detail. So we'll start with the check-in. Start with a generic opener. As I said, mine is quite sincerely always, how's it going? And it is very intentionally vague. There's a reason for that. I want the answer to this question to essentially give me an insight into how this person is feeling, what they're thinking about, what their priorities are. Some people are going to reply and tell you about their weekend. Some people are going to reply and tell you about their dog. Sometimes they're going to give you a laundry list of all of the things that they're doing at work. What does that tell me? I might be sitting there thinking, all right, this person seems to be feeling overwhelmed with the number of things that they need to do. That's probably going to be a top priority for us in terms of what can we pull off their plate. Maybe we need to reprioritize. And maybe we just need to take a moment to recenter and to discuss one of my favorite things, which is what happens if this doesn't get done? The answer is almost always nothing. Nothing happens if it doesn't get done. But sometimes people need to be reminded that everything is going to be okay, even if they don't get through their whole checklist. So that's just one example. Again, I use this generic opener to allow the other person to dictate to me sort of what they're feeling and thinking in that time and space. So pay attention to the vibe of the answer. It's going to tell you a lot about how this one-on-one is going to go. This goes back to our idea that you want to have a structure and a process because it creates more trust and more routine, which can be very comforting for people. But then you also have to be ready to throw the entire thing out the window if something comes up from this generic answer that's really important. And that's why I say here to make note of anything important that you want to follow up on. So listen to the vibe, listen to the answer, take some notes, think about like, what are all the things I'm hearing here that we should address in this time together? On the other hand, if you ask, how's it going? And you get something like, it's fine. Are any of you uncomfortable with the silence? That's okay too. It's normal for different people to have different responses to being asked open-ended questions, especially if they're encouraged not to necessarily respond with a work-related answer. It's okay to be quiet for a couple of seconds. You know, a lot of times it will allow people to collect their thoughts, both in this check-in and in later parts of a one-on-one. If you're sharing something that they maybe need a moment or two to reflect on before they can really come to terms with it, it's okay for it to be quiet for a minute. It's also okay to dig deeper. I like to ask specific questions, especially if I have somebody who I don't get a lot of information about who they are as a person outside of being an employee, or in this case, a developer. So I'll ask them about their hobbies, about their pets, what they do with their weekends, what they're interested in. Anything that gets them thinking just a little bit differently from responding purely as an asset to a team, and allows them to engage more fully as a human. So going back to that, it's a place for human to human time. It's a place for relationship building. The check-in is also the part that, since you're not dictating sort of where this conversation is going to go, you have to understand that you never know what the answers are going to be. This idea gets credited back to my former SASH colleague, Jabari, who said that managing is improv, and he is right. And it is the situation that you never know what someone else is going to say to you, especially in this time going in to your one-on-ones, which is why you ask. That's why you say, how's it going? What's up? Whatever your parlance for that might be. And the more practice you get with this, and as I said, we'll discuss in a bit some suggestions on how everyone, no matter what position you're in, can get more practice with this. The practice will help you to show up to those situations and not worry about the response that you get, because you feel confident that you'll be able to manage and handle anything that comes up. Personally, I'm very comfortable with the okay is my go-to for anything that can just be utterly shocking to me, and people will shock you. That's one-on-one for people management. All right, so we're jumping over the work check-in because that's pretty self-explanatory. If your first check-in is predominantly based on things external to work, which I think is awesome, you can also ask, tell me about work, what's going on there, see what's in their head. Once you get through that point, and since this is a waterfall approach, essentially the rule of thumb is we keep moving through any of the stages as long as we have time, but we started with most important things, and therefore, if a topic comes up in your check-in that becomes the entire context of your 30, 45, or 60-minute call, that's fine. None of this is mandatory. Remember, we have a process, but we're going with the flow. So if you get to it, this is a great time for feedback. So some really good advice I got from one of my managers a couple of years ago is, given the course of a week, it's just all hands on deck. We are all on the same team. We're just trying to get our stuff done. We're all working together. It's not necessarily the best time to step back and address a situation that went weirdly, or a task that you thought was going to be handled by person A got dropped, something like that. The exception to this, of course, is red flag behaviors. And I say red flag behaviors to mean anything that would imperil a person's position. So breaking codes of conduct, not performing at an adequate level, those are in their own category. For this concept of feedback, we're talking about specifically things that are not red flag behaviors. So given that the rest of your week is just all hands on deck, we're all here, we're just trying to get the job done, your one-on-ones are a great time to revisit areas from feedback. So if there was a situation where you're like, wow, like I thought that we were going to finish this task on Tuesday and then I never heard from you again, and now it's Thursday, your one-on-one is a great time to be like, hey, what the heck happens there? Let's talk about this. I include here, we won't get to go in detail. It would have to be a separate talk into this feedback cycle, but just a quick overview of how I approach feedback as a manager, but also just as an individual existing in a workplace in the world, is that you start with your observation, which is quite simply, what did you observe? What happened? Remember that you want to focus that always on words and actions, not assumptions. A really good analogy for this that Life Labs teaches is to focus on things that a camera could capture, words, actions. It keeps you from making assumptions about the why behind why someone did something, why they acted in a certain way. Focusing purely, words and actions are good. Engage is this process of coming into the one-on-one and saying something like, hey, I want to talk about the meeting that you hosted on Tuesday. Can I give you some feedback on it? This kind of is the same as just gathering consent from the person, because it's okay for them to be in a position where they don't feel comfortable receiving feedback at that point. And again, as long as this isn't red flag behavior, that's fine. We all have our ups and downs. And by getting their buy-in first, you're sort of guaranteeing that they're going to have a positive or at worst neutral reaction to the feedback that you give, because they know you're about to give it. Share your feedback, again, focusing on those words and actions, and then do a check-in. This is similar to the concept that you want somebody to agree to getting the feedback first. The check-in gives you a sense of, how is this person feeling as a result of it? Do they agree with it? Do they view it as a possibility? Do you both share the reality of the situation that you're addressing? This is really important, again, in the same sense that like red flag behaviors that imperil someone's employment are not optional, of course, because if they do not choose to change them, that's why you have performance improvement plans. But beyond that, it really is any individual's choice whether they want to act on the feedback. You know, there's been plenty of times where I hope everyone has received some feedback that they've decided they don't want to act on. So I, for example, one time got the feedback that I don't have a strong executive presence. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. I had to kind of, think to myself, like, do I agree with that? Do I agree with the reality? And I eventually decided just not to act on it, because feedback is just that. It's someone else's opinion or thoughts on something about yourself. And it's that individual's decision whether or not they want to move forward with it. Assuming that they do, this is a great time to have takeaways. So takeaways can be positive. Takeaways can be based on positive behaviors. They can be based on negative behaviors. It's essentially, what do you want to see this person start doing, stop doing, continue doing, do more of, whatever it may be. A really good tip here, as much as possible, is to try to get the individual to come up with the takeaways on their own. And here's why I think that. If I were to tell you, lovely individual watching this chat, have to go and do X thing tomorrow, your reaction is most likely to start to evaluate, right? Like, do I agree with that? Do I think that's a good idea? Do I think it's feasible? All of those things. If you reverse that, and I say to a report, we've talked about how like sometimes the communication baton gets dropped and we don't end up with the same understanding of a conversation. What do you think we should do? And the other person comes up with an idea like, okay, maybe I can take down notes after our conversation so that we have a written copy of what was discussed. Now the situation's reversed. And now I'm in the position of saying, do I think that's a good idea? Do I think that's reasonable? Do I think that addresses what's going on? It shifts a little bit of the ideation from the person giving the feedback to the person receiving it. Plus, it a lot of times feels more valid when we come up with our own ideas, I think, both in terms of feedback and just generally as employees. And as I put here, I always like to prioritize actionable feedback. I think it's tough to give someone feedback on something if you cannot also help them to identify things that they can do to move forward, that's my preference, and always help with the next steps. Remember that feedback helps us to grow. I know if you're not comfortable giving feedback, you haven't been giving a lot of it. And I will say also that is not an individual state. We all are in a position at some point or another, and we will be again, where we are uncomfortable giving some feedback to someone. Just ask yourself, would I want to know this in their shoes? Am I telling them this to help them grow? Do I believe that this is beneficial to them, even if it might be painful to hear in the moment? If the answer to any or all of those is yes, it's good to give the feedback. It's okay if it's uncomfortable for a couple minutes. And remember, going back to one of my earlier points, it's okay if there's a little bit of quiet, especially when you're delivering feedback, especially when you're asking for the check-in, how they're responding to something, when they're coming up with takeaways. A little bit of quiet is okay. We all need some amount of time to process information. So silence can be good. All right. So if your one-on-one's still going on and you still have time and you've gotten through any feedback that you have, it's time for goals. All right. So goal setting should be focused around where the person wants to grow. It might also include, if you have a report or someone who's underperforming, in a sense, things that have been defined in that performance improvement plan to try to get them up to par. But generally, this is going to be, for some individual, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? The question of where we want to be is fantastic. I have a whole separate session on that. We won't be able to go into it, but let's assume that we already have that direction defined. And what we're working on here is, how do we set goals to get us there? So for this, I fall back to an oldie but goodie, which is SMART goals. I'm sure you've all heard of them. It's essentially making goals that are specific, measurable, achievable. I usually say actionable, realistic, and timely. I say actionable because goals must be able to be done by the individual in question. I don't believe that you can have a goal for yourself that is dependent on someone else doing something, because both as a manager and just as a person, we recognize that we cannot control what anyone else does, ever. It's just not our bandwidth. So anything that's a goal for an individual has to be actionable by them. Another thing that I say is, goals are especially great when they're almost so easy that you can't help but do them. That's when we have the most success, when we're making things that are so within our options, so within our availability, and that we're like, yeah, like, of course I can do this. This is great. A really common thing that will come up when I'll talk about goal setting with people is we'll be talking about a quarter, and they'll say like, oh, I'm gonna spend 40 hours working on a programming course. And I'm like, I love that, except let's make it like 10 hours. Always underestimate the amount of time that you're going to have to spend on any individual goal. In the same, I feel like I repeat myself a lot, in the same way that you can always order more food and you can always schedule more time for your one-on-ones, you can always make a goal again at a later point to continue doing the thing that you wanted to be doing for more time. Start the first one with something that feels incredibly achievable, because those are the ones that we end up doing. And again, these should be based around, as much as possible, where the individual wants to grow. We're not cogs in a machine. We're all individuals. How we all grow from a certain level to the next level, from one level from the next, from one company to the next, they all look different. And it's up to individuals to determine what are the ways that they want to grow, what are the areas they want to get stronger in, and what do they want to do to get there. Another tip I have here is to keep track of any goals in your one-on-one tracker to ensure easy follow-up. I literally put them at the top of the document, and they're either a checkbox if it's a binary, or a counter if it's, I'm going to spend 12 hours practicing programming via whichever website, and we'll keep track of the actual numbers. Make it easy to follow up on it, and make that information easily available to both yourself and to the other person, because that gives it the strongest probability that you will follow up. I'll take a very quick pause to just remind anyone to put any questions in the chat, because we are rapidly approaching the Q&A section. So, all right. And remember, having goals is what fuels our progress, especially as we get later into our careers. So this is even more so true when you're managing people or working with people who are more senior and have more years of experience. Things can start to feel very routine and very rote. Having goals both helps us to feel that progression as we're moving ourselves forward, but also gives us a tangible thing to look back on, to see the ways in which we've grown and to see the changes that we've made in ourselves, the things that we've done. And once more, they really help when you need to write performance reviews. And I can't stress enough that that is something that a lot of us will have to do at some point in our lives. I always wrap up with any other topics, this open call to what else do you want to talk about? A lot of times the answer might be that they have nothing, and that's fine. Sometimes they'll want to drop an interesting question at the end, like, oh, by the way, I wanted a promotion. And again, my response is, okay. I, in my head, wish that we didn't wait until the last 3 minutes of the discussion to talk about this, but that's fine. You can always schedule more. And if they do drop a bombshell of something that you're not expecting and not prepared to talk about, it is always fine to say, that's a great question. I'm open to having that conversation. Can we start with this next week? It's a really good one. So let's go over some quick best practices. As I said, I write notes. I actually keep a one-on-one tracker for every person. Your style may vary. It can very simply have, a list of dates and conversation topics covered. As I said, I usually put at the top any goals that we're working towards for a given quarter with either a checkbox for a yes, no, or a counter for things. I always share it with the other person. That information, at least I think, should always be available to both the individual and the manager, or to the two people who are involved in these one-on-ones. And both of you should be allowed to do. Be consistent. This is a really big one. If you say you're going to have one-on-ones every week, do your best to have one-on-ones every week. It is completely fine. Things do happen. There's conflicts. You need to run out and do something else. Like that happens, and that's fine. But as much as possible, make sure that if you're having a one-on-one, if you say you're going to have a one-on-one every week, have a one-on-one every week. And if it's supposed to be at 2 p.m. on a Friday, try not to move it at 1:57 on a Friday. This comes back to the building trust in the same way that, having a structure is comforting, knowing who to expect in a meeting is comforting, knowing that you're always going to have that time with your report and with your manager is really helpful. And consistency is one of the only ways to prove that you'll be available when you say that you're going to be available. Dig deep with lots of questions. Questions are great, both about the person as an individual, about their thought process, about what might be driving any topics that they have, anything of interest that they want to talk about. And I know, once again, broken record, find and follow up on takeaways. Anything that you can have to bring forward from one-on-one to the next one, or to one in the future, creates that sensation of, again, the progression. And also just like a trail. It's nice to feel that, you're not always sitting down and starting from scratch, but that you're constantly building and moving towards whatever it is that you both have defined as your eventual end goal. So what next? Here are my practice steps. As I said, find ways to practice. The only way that you get better at this and at everything is to practice. Look at your current one-on-ones, both if you're a manager or if you're an IC, and identify what's working, what would you like to change. Find opportunities for more of them, especially in situations where, if you're not currently a manager, you're working with someone who is more junior than yourself, maybe in a mentorship opportunity. This might be within your company, or you could look outward to an organization, one that I volunteered with for years, Built by Girls, that will create mentorship opportunities to you. It's really great to have time being on both sides of the table, both, the typical one being IC and manager, but even just mentor mentee. Getting to switch that gives you a lot of perspective. Practice your improv. I like to play games during meetings to loosen up, like responding cold to questions. One of the things I'll do in my people management workshops is we'll just play a short game where I'll just ask people random questions. So I'll call on a name and just say, like, if you could live in any fantasy universe, what fantasy universe would you live in? And then call the next person and be like, okay, if you could have a celebrity best friend, who would you have? And it's just meant to take away that stress of feeling like you're not going to have the right answer to a question, because there is no right answer and there's no wrong answer. It's just being comfortable with the unknown and trusting that you're going to have a response. Another thing I do in the workshops that I recommend is play with a group one-on-one roulette. In this case, everyone takes a turn being both the manager in a situation and also the report. Sometimes I'll give the reports a preset situation that they can describe and kind of a series of instructions for like how to respond to certain questions in a situation. The more time you spend having these conversations, the more comfortable you will get with them, the more comfortable you will get with that sensation that I just never know what anyone is going to say to me, but I trust that I will have the right response. This and anything else you can think of to find those opportunities, I highly recommend. That's it for what I have for my content. I put my contact information here. As I said earlier, I'm a director for Women Who Code NYC. We have events pretty much every other week, multiple times a month. Would love to see you there. And with that, we have some time for Q&A.
Awesome session. I'll jump right into the questions because there are a lot. So one question says, wanted to hear how you do this. I moved teams and I'm under a new manager. Somewhere along the way, I feel like I've been going off track with the project. What do I do? Am I overthinking it?
So if I'm hearing it correctly, there's a lack of confidence that a project is going as expected, and some of that could be alleviated by the manager. So first, I'll try to keep this quick so we can get through, because you said there's a lot of questions. But first and foremost, it is not your responsibility in this position or in any position to come up with more answers than you're being provided by the people who are giving you this guidance, right? If someone for example, if someone tells you you need to write up this project, you need to code this project, and you do your best to do it, and you're never told that it needs to, have some given output, that's not your responsibility, because you can't read their minds, right? So if you're not being told that something is going off track, despite your efforts to find out from the correct stakeholders, that is something that, again, it's just beyond your responsibility, because what else can you do? And that being said, openly asking about it with your manager. If there's other important stakeholders, open the conversations with them. Make sure that you're including into the conversation, being your best advocate to get yourself the answers that you need is fantastic. But yes, try to also sleep at night knowing that, an easier example is like if your boss tells you that you're doing a great job in your role and I've been in this position, some imposter syndrome, and you're thinking like, well, maybe I'm not really. At some point, you do have to come to terms with, if no one's telling you otherwise, it's not your responsibility to create more hurdles for yourself than already exist.
So another question says, how can I begin to build a relationship with my skip level? I've only ever met them in a meet and greet, so I'm not sure how to pursue one-on-ones.
Yeah, great question. So some people in any position really will schedule automatic one-on-ones, and some of them just won't. It depends on the person. It is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. I think I would first identify, before you go and make an ask, what it is you want to get from that. If it really is just relationship building, I would make an ask that's like, hey, I'd love to develop our relationship further. Can I put a recurring half-hour coffee chat on your calendar once a quarter or once a month, whatever that may be? Being able to define ahead of time what it is you're looking for is helpful both for you and for the person that you're asking. Because, if you actually want to talk about project updates, you'd want to specify that sort of thing. So that would be my advice, is clarify to yourself what it is you want to get from that, because you don't want to go into as someone who's done this many times, you don't want to go into those meetings without topics to talk about, because trust me, they're not going to come with topics. So you want to make sure you're going to make the most of the time. Just define that for yourself ahead of time. Know what it is you're asking for, and then feel confident asking. And remember that the worst thing they can say is no.
So another question is, I really only interact with my manager at our one-on-one since I am a junior and I'm working with a senior developer all the time. How can I get to know him better without being awkward? He doesn't ask, how's it going?
You can always ask him. Another one, I don't actually think I said this, but I normally do. Another thing that I'll use to build relationships with anyone really is I'll share things about myself. I learned this back when I was at Clearpool. That was pretty early in my career. And there were a lot of people in the company who I didn't really, we didn't overlap with our work, and I didn't share anything lifestyle with them. But if I'd run into them in the lunchroom, you want to, feel comfortable having a conversation. So personally, my go-to was softball. I would just be like, yeah, I play a lot of softball. And then I'd come in the Mondays and, the head of finance or whatever would come over and be like, how was softball? Like, well, let me tell you. And it kind of gives you that easy, you're almost gifting them with an easy conversation starter with yourself, which makes them feel more comfortable with having that relationship with you. I mean, it also puts you on comfortable ground that you kind of know you're going to be asked about something that you're probably going to have a lot to say about. So that's what I would say is start by feel like you can always ask them the how's it going question, but you can also respond to things or bring up topics about yourself that demonstrates that vulnerability and that interest. I think is a great place to start.
That's an awesome tip. Usually finding something common always keeps the conversation going, and most of the time it is sports. Another question is, I have a few direct reports that are chatty. How do you make them feel heard but still hit the points you need to hit without scheduling a 90-minute meeting?
Very good question. I had, more than one, but one of these at Stash who I adored. And I would just have to have an internal timer. If I knew there was something we would need to get to and it's, 15 minutes past, I'd be like, how much I love chatting. And I'm so glad that we have this relationship. I do want to talk to you about this thing. Is it okay if we transition into this next topic? You're the manager. It is your right. They'll be fine. You can always chat with them more later.
Another person says, how can one confidently ask for a salary raise and a promotion in one-on-ones?
It's a bigger topic than I have time for right now, but let me condense it down as best as I can. One is I would, as much as it is in your power to do so, is first understand what the process is at your company, because it changes from company to company. So you want to know, ask your manager. They're the one in the position to tell you whether or not they do, different question. But the thing that you can do, remember, actionable things, is you can ask and you can say, what is the process at our company to get a raise, and what is the process at our company to get promotion? Don't assume that they are the same thing. Sometimes they are tied together. They are not always. So again, you want some understanding. The other thing I would say is, in so much as you can, you should aim to do it in the future, the near future, with the goal that your conversation with your manager is going to say, I'm really looking to get a promotion to senior software engineer. Can we either look at the competency matrix, if one exists, to see what things I would need to do, or if one doesn't exist, can we come up with a plan wherein we both agree that given X amount of time doing these things listed, I would then be qualified to get that promotion. So instead of asking for it, based on what I've already done, it's come to that consent together about what it will look like in X amount of time given Y things. And then you almost shouldn't have to ask. So again, like putting yourself in that position where you've had a voice in the process, you're learning as much information as you can, and then you're coming up together with a plan.
Another quote person asks, how to discuss not so stellar performance, like falling behind submission dates, owning up failures at a prototype or project in one-on-ones.
So if I understand correctly, this is a question about like, how do we address underperformance?
Yes.
Okay. So again, just bigger topic, right? But in general, you always want to have, as much as you can, everything that is an expectation of a role in writing, and it needs to be clear and concise. And then you want to take note of things that do not meet those expectations, again, in writing, so that you have evidence to show. And remember, going back to our evidence, everything is based on things people say and things people do, not assumptions, so that you can compare. Here are how your actions and behaviors are comparing against what the expectations are for this role. And then from there, you can identify your gaps and work towards addressing them. One just quick thing there too is, again, identify out loud to people as much as possible. What's a red flag? Red flag being something that imperils someone's employment, versus here are just, personal optimizations that might get you where you want to go faster.
So how do you give specific actionable feedback if you might not be very familiar with their tech or job? For instance, giving a front-end engineer feedback if I have experience with backend.
Yeah, I think especially if you're their manager, you're not expected to be better than them at their jobs, right? That's why they're in their job and you're in yours. I'm not expected to be a better front-end engineer than my front-end engineers. I've never been a front-end engineer. I'm expected to be a good manager to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be better than them technically. And a lot of times you won't, because they're spending 100% of their time being an awesome front-end engineer, and you're spending some percentage of your time being an awesome people manager. And those two things aren't the same. So the person who's doing more, it's going to be better at it. That being said, for any gaps that you have that you cannot address personally as a manager, get the information from someone else. Go to the head of their chapter and say, like, hey, like, if this person is an iOS engineer, like, where can I find information or feedback for them about how they're performing in that area? Use things like 360s. So have them collect feedback from their peers and from other people who are doing the things that they're doing. Basically, to sum that up, don't take it upon yourself to be the expert in all areas, because that's impossible. Recognize where you can be the person who is the authority on performance in certain areas, and then find ways to get constructive critical feedback from others where those gaps exist.
Do you have things to give feedback on every week? What's an example of what specific feedback you would give to someone, and how do you watch out for things to mention?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I wish I had feedback to give every week. The truth is, I just don't. In my previous team, I had 8 direct reports, so there was just, I never had something for all 8. You do the best that you can. How do you keep an eye out for it? Kind of a similar answer is just pay attention. Pay attention, write things down, attend their meetings if they invite you to something, and then collect feedback from other people in whatever way. Companies have different processes. Some of them have, again, like a 360 review where it's like a formalized process, or else you can do something informally. You can ask your reports like, hey, I'd love to get you more feedback. Who should I talk to? I'm big on that. Ask them who they think that would give good feedback on how their performance is. Examples would be, if you have a tech lead who's hosting a sprint grooming meeting, it's like, okay, here are some things I liked about what we did. I noticed that you asked that person their opinion and got them to contribute in a way that they don't normally do. I would love for you to do more of that next time when you ask that person for their feedback. Can you also summarize it back to them to make sure that you understand it? That would be an example of giving them feedback and also coming up with an actionable takeaway.
Kelly, do you think a conversation about salary increase would be initiated by me and it should be a separate meeting, or I can talk about it on my one-on-one?
Either is fine. You are always allowed to ask about salary. It is, hopefully you're in a position where your manager advocates for you and brings it up. That'd be awesome. But as we said earlier, we cannot control what other people do. We can only control what we do. And yes, your salary is always your business and you can always ask about it. One-on-ones are a perfect place. I would say if you want to schedule a separate time for it, get consent. So be like, I'd love to talk, or even if you're just thinking about when to schedule it, it's like ping your manager and be like, I would love to have a conversation about salary and raises. Should we have it on one-on-one, or would you like me to schedule a separate meeting? The bonus to that is they know the conversation is coming, and conversations almost always go better when there's not surprises.
So probably the last 2 questions, because we're like over time. So for career growth and progression in the tech field, what are some of the things you should highlight as an IC with the skip level?
I think your mileage will vary here because it really depends on your relationship with the person and kind of what you view from them. And also, like, as much as possible, have a good understanding of what your manager's relationship with them is, because kind of the best version is that you don't have to tell them anything because your manager's already evangelizing how awesome you are. But you just don't know what that situation is unless you're paying attention, right? So if you trust that they're already doing that job for you, I think it's actually in your best interest to be more curious and thoughtful and to bring questions and topics to that conversation versus to bring your accomplishments. But that being said, if you do feel like you're in a position where your contributions aren't being recognized or aren't being heard in the places that they need to be, you can always address something like, I'd love to talk to you about this project that we just completed. I thought it was really exciting. And here's something I think you'd be interested in.
So do you have any specific advice for running one-on-ones with senior developers who might be more technically proficient than you?
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's, I only because I answered that earlier, but like, it's okay that they're more technically proficient than you. Like, especially if they're more experienced, like obviously they're better at their job. Like of course they are. That's great. In my position, I want everyone to be so good at their jobs that they don't need me, because that would be awesome. That's like my whole goal as a manager. I get it though, because it is a stressful situation. I think again, like every team, every company, it's always different being a manager. So there's no one size fits all solution to any of these. But one thing I would say is that like, don't always try to divest yourself of the need to be the best person at the thing that you're managing people for. Because again, just by nature, if you're spending some time managing people, you are spending that time not being a technical person. And those other people who are not managing people are spending that time being technical people. So if you kind of picture it as like trajectories, they're just spending more time doing it in general. So they're probably going to get better at it than you are. And that's okay. Again, your role is not always to be better at their job than they are. Sometimes it's, what can I do to assist you? How can I take things off your plate? What are the things that you're interested in growing in? And then if you do need, to repeat one of my earlier answers, that technical feedback for them, feel free to get it in other ways. Ask them. Be like, do you want to, like, you're an awesome Java engineer. And I've never written Java in my life. So it's like, but I'd love to help get you the support you need to continue growing. What are some of the areas that you've identified, or who are some of the people that you work with that I could ask on your behalf, or you can, to get some actionable feedback specifically in the technical realm?
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I hope someday along the way I end up in your team. That would be awesome. That's the dream. Also, we did get a couple questions asking if you could share the deck for the talk. They said that the slides are really interesting, so probably for future reference as well. If you could share it in the chat, that would be helpful.
I probably won't be able to share it in the chat right now, but I will make a point of sharing it on my LinkedIn at some point in the near future. I think that's the easiest, or maybe that or Twitter. I'll share it in both of those places. But this recording will also be available shortly after the conference is over. And I'll make sure to post that on my LinkedIn and Twitter as well to make sure that everyone's able to see it if they want to.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk, and the question and answers were awesome.
Yes, thank you for all those questions. They were fantastic. And please do get in touch. I would always love to hear from you all what you find helpful and what you're going to do differently going forward.
Okay, then thank you for joining, everyone. You can move on to the other sessions that are taking place. If you do have any questions, like Kelly mentioned, you could always connect with her. Her socials are right up here on the screen. So thank you. Bye.